We are live. Okay, so I would now request all of you to, with your permission, ma'am.
Please start.
So, good evening and a very warm welcome.
Evening.
Okay. So, good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you. Welcome to the web book discussion on women, witch hunts, and social transformation, based on the book Witch Hunts, Culture, Patriarchy, and Structural Transformation by our visiting professors, Dr. Govind Kelkar and Professor Devanathan. And I would, the formal welcomes will of course be done by Dr. Tanuka Endo. But before we hand over the formal proceedings into her hands, the commencement of the formal proceedings into the hands, I would just like to welcome all the discussants, all the resource persons on the screen. Extreme honor on behalf of Institute for Human Development, Center for Gender Studies, and of course our associated partners in organizing this event is Cambridge University Press. So thank you very much for joining in, and I would also like to thank all the attendees. As I also always give numbers in the beginning, we have had an overwhelming response from the attendees. Close to 700 registrations have taken place, and thank you for joining in. And of course, people are joining in as the discussion progresses. I would just request all the attendees to please place in their questions through the Q&A boxes on your screens. That will help the moderator to scan through all your questions, and I'm sure she will be able to place your questions to the discussants on the screen, the resource persons on the screen. And also, this particular event this web book discussion is being hosted live on our YouTube channel, which is IHD India, www.youtube.com/IHD India. When you go there, this is what is available there. And right after this discussion, of course, this will be available for dissemination. This particular recording will be available for dissemination. Now, it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Tanuka Endo, who's a professor at Institute for Human Development and also the coordinator for Center for Gender Studies, to formally commence the proceedings of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. So good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Gender Studies at the Institute for Human Development, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you, including the respected chairperson and moderator, Dr. Asha Kapoor Mehta, the esteemed authors, Dr. Govind Kelkar and Dr. Devanathan, distinguished panelists and guests for the evening, and of course to all of you who are attending today's webbook discussion on women, witch hunts, and social transformation. Let me take this opportunity to just at the outset say a few words about our center, which is the Center for Gender Studies at IHD. We focus on research on the contributions of women and also on the constraints faced by women in South Asia and especially in India. Now, here we fondly recall the contribution of late Professor Pritchard, who has been really a great inspiration for us. At the center, we focus on exploring the cross-cutting nature of gender issues, including its intersections with caste, class, religion, ethnicity, and so on. Now, we act as a forum for collaborative research. So we want to contribute to the evidence-based policy formulation in this process. And we have organized quite a few events in the recent past around gender-based issues. A panel discussion on care and labor market. It was organized jointly with IDRC, and a roundtable on rethinking the discourse on women's economic empowerment. It was organized with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and also with iWage. And very recently, we organized a webinar on gender-based violence. Now I come to the main part, which is the introduction of the esteemed chairperson and the panelists. So I start with Professor Asha Kapoor Mehta. She's a visiting professor at IHD and chairperson, Center for Gender Studies at IHD. She is also a senior advisor at iWage, erstwhile professor of economics at the Indian Institute of Public Administration. She has served as a member working group of feminist economists, chair of the subgroup on gender mainstreaming and effective accountability mechanisms, among many others. Her publications are on the issues of poverty, poverty dynamics, human and gender development indicators, gender budgeting, and so on. I now next come to all the panelists for today, for this evening. Alpa Shah completed her PhD in anthropology at the LSE, where she now teaches in the Department of Anthropology and also leads the LSE International Inequalities Institute Global Economies of Care research theme. She's the author of Night March Among India's Revolutionary Guerrillas, shortlisted for the 2019 Orwell Prize for Political Writing and the New India Foundation Book Prize, and longlisted for the Tata Literature Live Non-Fiction Book Award. Much of Alpa's writing is based on long-term ethnographic research, living as a participant observer among the communities she writes about. We next come to Sheila Operocha, the next panelist. She is the international coordinator and program manager of the Energia International Network on Gender and Sustainable Energy, Amsterdam. With 20 years of working experience in the gender and energy sector, she also provides technical support to Energia's activities on women entrepreneurship development, gender mainstreaming in energy programs, R&D, etc. Sheila co-chairs the SDG 7 Technical Advisory Group that has been convened by UNDESA to review progress on SDG 7 and its interlinkages with the other SDGs for the 2018 High-Level Political Forum. Dr. Mumbai Machera is a lecturer in the Department of Sociology and Social Work, University of Nairobi. She holds a PhD in Sociology and a Master's of Arts degree in Population Studies. She served as a senior researcher on the ProSovo project. She's also a gender and development specialist, working closely with academic institutions as well as local and international development agencies in pursuit of gender equality goals. The next panelist, Helen Mcdonald, is a senior lecturer in the Department of Anthropology, University of Cape Town, PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies, London. Her doctoral research investigated witch accusations in Chhattisgarh. She acted as an advisor to the state government seeking to find solutions to the problem of witch-related violence. Now, in 2017, she was elected President of Anthropology Southern Africa, which is an umbrella organization for anthropologists. Our next panelist is Virginia Kaka, Deputy Director at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Guwahati, Assam. He is former Professor of Sociology, Delhi University, and also a visiting professor at IST. Mr. Kaka, who belongs to a tribal community, Orang, from Chhattisgarh, has written extensively on tribes in the country. His book, State, Society and Tribes, Issues in Post-Colonial India, was published in 2008. His article, Tribes as Indigenous People of India, is often cited as essential reading for an understanding of India's tribal communities. We move on to our final panelist for the evening, Kalpana Kannabiran. She's Professor of Sociology and Director, Council for Social Development, Hyderabad, recipient of the Amartya Sen Award for Distinguished Social Scientist for her work in the discipline of law in 2012. Kalpana was awarded the V.K.R.V. Rao Prize for Social Science Research in the field of social aspects of law by ICSSR in 2003. She was part of the founding faculty of Nalsar University of Law and is co-founder of Asmita Resource Center for Women. Her work has focused on understanding the social foundations of non-discrimination, structural violence, and questions of constitutionalism and social justice in India, with specific focus on gender, sexual minorities, caste, Adivasi indigenous rights, and disability rights. Kalpana Kannabiran was a member of the expert group on the Equal Opportunity Commission, Government of India, 2007-8, and member of the Executive Committee of the International Sociological Association, 2014-18, among others. So I have come to the end of my introduction. of our chairperson as well as the panelists. And without taking any more time, I would request our respected chairperson, Dr. Asha Kapoor Mehta, to please start the proceedings for the evening. Over to you, Asha.
Thank you so much, Tanuka, for doing us proud by, introducing the Gender Center, by reminding us of Preet and how happy she would be to see the center taking off, and introducing all the panel, all the discussants, panelists who will be sharing their insights about the book with us. Tanuka is our head of the Gender Center at the IHT. IHD is privileged to be organizing this program to discuss a book that we can own for more than one reason. So we own the book totally because both the faculty members or both the authors who have written the book are IHD visiting faculty, and also because some of the field work that was done for this book was done at IHD through an ICSSR project that was that gave funding to IHD for purposes of fieldwork. We've got, Govind Kelkar is a feminist scholar. She's a visiting professor at the Institute. She's also a visiting professor at the Council for Social Development. She's executive director of the Gen Dev Center for Research and Innovation. She's distinguished adjunct faculty at the Asian Institute of Technology in Bangkok. She's been senior advisor at LANSI in Seattle. She's regional council member of the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. She's been senior advisor at the UN Women. She's coordinated gender mainstreaming in Asia for IFAD, and she's worked extensively on gender relations in rural energy and women's land rights in Asia. Dev Nathan is an economist. He's visiting professor at the Institute for Human Development, research director of the Gen Dev Center for Research and Innovation, research advisor to the Society of Labor and Development. He's co-editor of the Cambridge University Press series titled Development Trajectories in Global Value Chains. And he's currently working on a book on labor, gender, and environmental justice in global value chains. This book on which is called Witch Hunts, Culture, Patriarchy, and Structural Transformation, okay, is actually a book that focuses on a very difficult aspect of community behavior that's led to persecution of people through witch hunts. So I just see a few, raise a few points in the context of issues that struck me while reading the book before I hand over to Dev Nathan. But witch hunts is basically about persecution of people who are perceived to be witches. These are people who are supposed to have supernatural powers, which they supposedly use to cause harm to other humans. So what Dev and Govind have done is they reviewed something like 110 case studies of witch persecution in India and elsewhere between 2014 and 2016. Their case studies pertain to 5 Indian states of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha, Rajasthan, and Telangana. In addition to reviewing these case studies and getting the information that they needed to put together to prepare the case studies, they reviewed the literature, looked at court judgments, looked at police records, held interviews with the police and with administrative officers. They talked to relevant civil society organizations. They analyzed court cases related to women and men who were persecuted by their communities as witches. And they included analyses from Africa, the Pacific, Amazonia, all focusing on indigenous and other rural societies. However, they note that witch hunts also occurred in early modern Europe and in North America. And then they talk about who is a witch and use Rodney Needham's definition of a witch as someone who causes harm to others by mystical means, and then refer to Ronald Hutton, who modifies the definition to a person who uses non-physical means to cause misfortune or injury to other humans, and then promptly sidestep both these definitions and decide that actually they don't want to deal with the issue of whether or not the supernatural exists, but they want to focus basically on, on looking at the belief and what that belief does, to causing people to behave in certain ways, as a result of which they persecute people as witches. So, so they use words, they explain that there is a lot of use of words like mystical and occult and magical or supernatural in the literature on the subject, and that these words are used interchangeably. But then they try not to get drawn into the existence of people who can cause harm to others through supernatural means. And hence, they then create their own definition in which they define a witch as a person who is perceived to cause harm by supernatural means. In other words, their focus is on the belief that someone uses or has used supernatural powers to cause harm. So they stay away from whether or not people actually possess those supernatural powers, and focus on the social perception of causing harm by supernatural means as a defining characteristic of the witch. They mention the existence of persons who use these supernatural powers for good, fleetingly, and just say that that many of the healers are mostly men, and they're also the witch finders. And then they use three main concepts for analysis: the concept of culture, change in gender relations and gender struggles, and structural transformation, often brought about by the spread of trade and the market economy, which has led to socioeconomic transformations and witch hunts. And then after presenting their case studies from the 5 states that I'd mentioned earlier, they categorize the cases on the basis of the types of persecution involved in these incidents, which range from torture, extracting confessions, public humiliation, social boycott, sexual and physical violence, murder, being expelled from the village, being made to pay a large fine. And then they present cases, some cases where the accused actually managed to resist the accusations. They also identify, factors which cause the persecutions, including land, the fact that you want to hijack the land that the person owns, or jealousy, or causing illness, or assertion of independence, or resisting sexual advances, or asking for dues, or unconventional religious practices. And then describe witch hunts as part of a creation of patriarchy and the struggle over power between women and men, with men seizing power that women originally possessed, and categorization of women as witches and men as witch finders as crucial in this myth of male power. As in other indigenous societies, women were considered evil and therefore actual witches or having the potential to be witches. So in conjunction with this categorization, there was a denial of women's rights to land and establishment of patrilineage, control over expenditure, and even control over women's bodies, with women facing the threat of being denounced as witches if they in any way transgressed what was perceived as appropriate behavior, or if they acquired knowledge that was prohibited for women. And then after discussing the many ways in which witch hunts occurred in various parts of the world, they focus on policies that can be used to eliminate witch hunts and ways in which communities and states can deal with witch hunts. Before I ask Devnathan to make a presentation on witch hunts, culture, patriarchy, and structural transformation, may I request Qudsiya Ahmed as Head Academic Publishing, Cambridge University Press in India, to briefly say a few words about why they decided to publish this very interesting book. Qudsiya?
Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Mehta. On behalf of Cambridge University Press, I would like to thank each one of you for attending this event today. It's a wonderful collaboration with the Institute of Human Development for organizing the discussion around one of the very important titles for this year that we have, Witch Hunts, Culture, Patriarchy, and Structural Transformation, authored by Professor Govind Kelkar and Professor Devnathan. Thank you, ISG, for setting up this collaboration. We've been working together for many years in various capacities, and I understand that our ties have only strengthened. I humbly hope that our association continues like this. Coming back to our wonderful authors and the book, this work has been developed for over a period of 40 years and uses a combination of political economy approach supported by cultural analysis to understand this very important phenomena called witch hunts. And I guess all of us in our personal and professional capacities have been intrigued by this phenomena and this term. The authors have interviewed actual survivors from across the globe. It carries first-hand accounts of these brutal trials which were performative in nature. I consider today's event as a celebration of the body of work that both Govind and Dev have put together. For the availability of the book, because I'm a publisher, I must talk about that as well. It's there on Amazon for you to buy in a physical copy and as a core book, as a Kindle book. The institutional access to the book is available on Cambridge Core, which is the press's online repository. I am looking forward to what the illustrious panel has to say about the book today. But yes, Professor, your question that why did we decide to publish this book? We have a great working relationship with Professor Devnathan, and getting on board Professor Govind Kelkar was, I would say, a great advantage for the publishing program at the press. We've met several times, and he's also one of our series editors, and we've had very passionate discussion around how he wants to drive the series and how the press wants to develop a wider platform. But when he came forth with this brilliant idea, which I think I was personally smitten with. I mean, I was so excited that we've been doing so much around politics and sociology, but something that is going to be so interdisciplinary and has been written in such a captivating way. I mean, there was absolutely no reason to be not excited by this wonderful project. So we were very happy to consider this, and we are rather very proud that we published this today. So I'm eager to hear what the other panelists have to say about the work. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'd like to, I believe Sheila has joined us with a lot of difficulty. Sheila, can we say hello to you? And can we have you on the video?
Hello.
Hey, Sheila, sorry you had so much trouble joining us, but great to see you and you're looking good.
I did have problems joining us, but I'm glad to be here.
Wonderful. Welcome. You've already been introduced. I believe Alpa has a child, and she needs to look after the child and needs to leave the meeting a little early. So before Dev makes his presentation, may I request Alpa, if you're there, Alpa? Yeah. So would you like to make your presentation now? Would you like to give us your comments?
I just wanted, Dev, Govind, are you okay with that, or would you? I can find other ways to look after Amari. And would you like to go ahead? I mean, you are the authors after all, so it makes some more sense. You have a
choice, Alpa. We can't not hear your comments.
We have to hear you.
We have two choices. Either you can look after your child and then rejoin whenever you can rejoin in the course of the next hour, or you make a presentation. Give us your comments now, and then Dave can make the presentation about the book, whichever you prefer.
Okay. Let me go ahead, and because maybe I will also draw out a few things that Govind and Dev might like to expand on. Firstly, I just wanted to say thank you to so many people. First to Govind and Dev for writing this book. It's super important. It's great that the gender part of the IHD is launching it, and Cambridge University Press published it. I think this is a book that is important not just for those of us who are interested in gender, but it's super important to anybody who is interested in economics, politics, or religion, not just kinship and gender. I hope that some of my comments will draw out why this is the case. So yeah, thanks for having us. Thanks for writing this, publishing it, and having this launch that will draw attention to this book, which in my mind is probably the most important book to understand the phenomenon of witch accusations and witch hunts in India, although the global comparison is throughout the book. You know, we're all, as Miss Ahmed said, we're all fascinated to a certain extent by witches and their secret and subversive powers to change things. Most of the time, they're presented as the evil of society, as persons that are supposed to have supernatural powers which they use to harm other humans, you know, as Govind and they point out in the book. Of course, in recent years, we have also a more subversive reading that has tried to recover witches from their negative imagery and turn them into gentle, generous creatures. I was reminded of this point last night, actually, while I was reading to my 2-year-old daughter, Julia Donaldson's Room on the Broom. I don't know if you know this book, but it's a story basically about a kind witch who is inviting a whole collection of animals to join her on her broom, much to the annoyance of her cat, who thinks it's getting all too crowded. But certainly in many indigenous communities in India, where much of the rich interview-based work of Govind and Dev's witch hunts is based, witches are despised, they're tormented, they're tortured, they're beaten, they're burnt, they're sometimes even killed. Denouncing women, and it is usually women, allows for the most brutal forms of violence. And you know, I mean, in Govind and they've opened the book with this amazing statistic that in the 15-year period between 2001 and 2016, the National Crime Records Bureau records show more than 2,600 murders where accusations of witchcraft or persecutions were recorded as the motive. And this is most, as they point out, most likely going to be an underestimate. These cases were concentrated, interestingly, as they point out, in the Indian tribal belts, especially, you know, Jharkhand and in Orissa. So what Govind and Dev are trying to do in this book is get to the bottom of why this happens, for it's going to influence what we can do about the horrific abuses to people that takes place in the name of witchcraft. Now, as Professor Mehta pointed out, the book is very rich in its accounts of the victim's point of view, which is too often neglected in accounts of witchcraft. So Govind Dev and their researchers trace, I think it's about 110 case studies of witch persecutions between 2014 and 2016, mainly in Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Orissa, Telangana, and I think a couple in Rajasthan as well. But what is particularly important about these accounts from my reading of the book is especially how they are tied to a much wider reading of the development of a modern capitalist economy, the rise of patriarchy and the resultant inequalities and dispossessions. So what they're doing in the book, which is really super important, is they're merging a culturalist reading of witchcraft focused on meaning making to much wider structural changes in political economy. So amongst the numerous issues that they point out from their cases, I'd like to highlight a few in order to pull out one thread, which to me is perhaps the most important in the book. So it is, as I said, women who are primarily persecuted. Where men are accused, it's usually because their wives are also accused, and accusers are most often close relatives. Accused witches were often those who are better off, accused for not sharing what they have, or having too much, having benefited too much by exploiting others. So women were also accused in order to dispossess them of their land and property, both by middlemen and kin. And the overwhelming reasons of the range of reasons given for witch persecutions is capturing land in order to control, which is in the control of women, and also jealousy. So as such, Govind and Dev outlined 3 key factors which constitute a gendered socioeconomic dimension of witch hunts in Central and Eastern India. First, seeing women as evil and causing harm by supernatural knowledge or force translates into the persecution of them as witches. Second, this persecution itself becomes a process through which gender relations are recast as being patriarchal, so that men have increasing control over the productive assets, resources, and decision-making that may have lied with, women. Third, there's also an attack on people who are thought to have illegally or immorally accumulated wealth, or who are doing better than relatives and neighbors. And it's usually the women of the family who are denounced as the witch. Now, throughout the book, Govind and Dev tie in an Indian analysis to a much wider range of accounts of witchcraft across the globe, but also in history. So we move from the rise of occult accusations in contemporary Africa all the way to early modern Europe. In doing this, what they're providing is a much needed Indian narrative to some very path-breaking literature on the rise of capitalism and its impact on women that has come to us from Maria Mies and Silvia Federici. And now, although they only briefly mention this work, let me take the liberty of outlining it a little bit here. So Federici, Silvia Federici, in her book Caliban and the Witch, she argued that the European witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, in which it was a time when hundreds of thousands of women were burned as witches, served to create and enforce what was a newly established role for women in society, who were now being confined to unpaid reproductive labor. And this was in order to satisfy the needs of an ascendant and capitalist order. So on the one hand, we had, the conquest of the Americas and the enslavement of Africans and indigenous people in the New World, and communal land back in Europe was being enclosed at home. And what was necessary in this was to divide the unity of men and the unity of women and impose a whole new regime of work and the body. So Federici argues in her book that the transition from feudalism to capitalism basically had to be a transition in which production was separated from reproduction, and the resultant sexual division of labor had to be created and enforced through extreme violence. So women had to be remade. They had to be remade in the image of capital. They had to be constructed as they had to be destroyed. Basically, they had to be destroyed as heretics, as healers, as disobedient wives. Women who dared to live alone or dared to revolt had to be put down. So Federici says that the witch hunt, rather than representing what was the last dying breath of a feudal order, was in fact a tool to discipline and shape the emerging working class, and hence it was integral to the transition to capitalism. So at the heart of this transition was therefore the control of women's unpaid reproductive labor, a complete redefinition of the human body. The birth of the proletariat and the patriarchy of wage labor basically required a war against women, and this was the witch hunt. So today, she says that this new violence kind of continues in the form of structural adjustment programs and in new rounds of land enclosures in developing countries. Now, the reason why I provide this backdrop is because I think it's really important to situate Govind and Dev's work in this wider narrative in order to understand how we must think about witches and witch hunts. Too often we have been focused on the actor-centered point of view on witch hunts, which is why Govind and Dev cast their book in this wider political economy understanding. And as such, this wider historical approach, combining political economy and cultural analysis, is very important and much needed in India. Now, if Federici traces the transition from feudalism to capitalism in Europe, what I find interesting to think through in Govind and Dev's book are the Indian particularities. So what is the Indian narrative here? Now, fascinatingly, what I found most fascinating about Govind and Dev's book is this comparative analysis of witch accusation amongst India's tribes and caste. So at one end of the spectrum, they say that among the hunter-gathering communities like the Birhor, witchcraft accusations or witch hunts are absent. Among settled agricultural communities, such as the Santals or the Mundas, both witchcraft accusations and witch hunts are very prevalent. And then right at the other end, amongst the Hindu castes, there is a strong belief in witchcraft, but actually an absence of witch hunts. So they provide this brilliant analysis that the presence of witch hunts is not actually the success of patriarchy, but is in fact a sign of women's autonomy under the rise of patriarchal structures. Because women have autonomy and independence, their subjugation is necessary through witch hunts, and hence there is a prevalence of witch hunts in Adivasi areas, in particular of India, where in places where women are fully under patriarchal structures, such as amongst the Hindu castes of the plains, there is no need for witch hunts. So one interpretation of this trajectory, and the one I think that Govind and Dev favor, but please correct me if I'm wrong, draws on but is different to the Federici analysis. This is that these comparative differences represent not a transition from feudalism to capitalism, a la Federici, but a transition from relatively more egalitarian redistributive communities, such as the hunter-gathering communities, to accumulative economies under capitalism, which encourage individual accumulation and create both internal inequalities within communities and the rise of patriarchy. What I'd like to do is I'd like to suggest another interpretation here, which Govind and Dev don't really draw out as I read it, which is that this transition is also somewhere along the lines of a tribe-caste continuum of Sanskritization, whereby on the one hand, you have hunter-gathering societies who don't have witches or witch hunts, and among whom patriarchy is more limited, to more settled agricultural tribes who are getting more Hinduized and more patriarchal and have both witches and witch hunts, to the Hindu castes who are so patriarchal that they believe in witches, but they no longer need the witch hunts as their women are fully subordinated. So this begs the question of to what extent, in the case of India's Adivasis, the witch hunts are a question of the Hinduization of the tribe and the related patriarchy, or to what extent they're the result of the rise of capitalism and the related patriarchy, or are they in fact a consequence of both? What is the relationship? Now, I'm asking about the significance, the relative significance of Hinduization amongst Adivasis versus the penetration of capitalism because of the implications, as one of the fascinating conclusions reached by Govind and Dev is that it is women's continued agency that in fact leads to witch hunts. They say, and I quote, "Had these women meekly accepted the dictates of patriarchy, there would not have been such witch hunts. It is when the creation of patriarchy is ongoing and not complete that such witch hunts have taken place. If and when the creation of patriarchy is completed, it is likely that such incidents would die down." Now, this is a fascinating and, in my view, a highly plausible kind of conclusion. And it's kind of very counterintuitive to what we are inclined to think about witches and witch hunts, that the witch hunts are in fact a reflection of women's autonomy and power. So it does beg the question about the sources of patriarchy, what kind of patriarchy, for the question of what is to be done. Do we attack the forces of capitalism and the continued dispossession that indigenous people in India face, or do we attack those of Hinduization? Here are the two, or how are the two interrelated? For it seems that in the Indian case, the two are, of course, totally intertwined in a way that has not been theorized for many of the other examples in the world that the book is filled with. And thus a politics against witch hunts would not be sufficient, so we basically have to combine both analysis. So it would be great to have Govind and Dev's further reflections on this, for the ways in which the relationship between capitalism and Hinduization is working and how it is affecting Adivasis is understood is going to be crucial for an anti-witch hunt politics. And to me, this is one of the most fascinating issues that Govind and Dev's book, important book, opens up. And the answer to this question may perhaps also determine how and when we may see the celebration a la Julia Donaldson and my 2-year-old daughter, rather than the denigration of the witch in Adivasi India. Okay, thank you. And thank you for this book.
Asha ma'am, you need to unmute yourself. You were saying something.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I hadn't unmuted. Alpa, thank you very much. May I request Dev to please make his presentation?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thanks, Alpa, for your comments. And I wish you could have stayed on longer, but we'll take it up. It'll be good. Well, I will use a PowerPoint. I don't usually do that, but I know it's difficult to make a long presentation when you are so alienated, both the speaker and the audience. It's very difficult. So I think the PowerPoint might help. That's why I'm using it. There's already been some kind of summary, but I'd just like to go over what it is we are trying to do in this book. We've already mentioned who is a witch, who is supposed to cause harm by, perceived to cause harm by supernatural means. In the African literature, terms occult or mystical are used, but more or less it's the same, supernatural. Sorry, I don't know why it's not moving.
Share, put the share again.
Share is there.
It was out.
Okay. Okay. Okay, what are we trying to explain in this book? We are trying to explain that there have been or are witch hunts across indigenous peoples in Central Asia, India, with extensions into caste, some extension to caste society, mainly peasant communities in Africa and early modern Europe too. So most of them, those who are persecuted or killed, 90% are women, though in early modern Europe, it was about 80%. Now, a main important point is that any woman could be a witch, but only special categories of men, either those who did not share or had certain kinds of relations to the occult or certain spiritual relations. We used 3 explanatory factors to go across geography and history. One is that of culture, the idea that there should be an idea of humans who are causing evil to others, causing harm. Second is the struggle over gender relations that led or recreated patriarchy. And third is that of structural transformation of various kinds, including from hoe to plow agriculture, and also that of the capitalist economy. What does this do? One is it de-exoticizes Africa. Otherwise, people tend to portray it as, oh, this is something that's happening in Africa. It also removes European exceptionalism. So Europe is not so different from the rest. It is there were witch hunts in Europe, and there have been witch hunts in India among the indigenous people, and they are there in Africa too. So we need to have a common explanatory framework for all of these kinds of witch hunts. In this, we take a feminist standpoint, that is taking the standpoint of those who were persecuted. That's why we focus not on witchcraft as such, but on witch hunts. Now, there are, of course, widely held beliefs in witchcraft. The Ralushai Commission in South Africa said that this is part of an African understanding of culture, of reality. Now, I'd like to, before going into other analysis, is belief in witchcraft a justified belief? We need to take that into account. One is there are 2 types of justification. One is evidence, which is often dismissed as a Western or Eurocentric requirement, or we can have a reliable process of acquiring knowledge. But as we know from all of the accounts across Asia, Africa, and Europe, the knowledge of a witch or witchcraft only comes through confessions, and where these confessions are acquired through torture or social pressure. So we cannot really accept torture as the basis of an epistemology giving us a justification for a belief. We need to, as Gayatri Spivak put it, we need to suture or stitch together human rights and cultural analysis. And here in this, we also take the point of Kwame Appiah, the Ghanaian philosopher, who held that ethics trumps identity. So rather than take witchcraft as existence, we take it as a metaphor, that this is an analogy, a form of explanation, and we should not mistake the event for the explanation. The event is certain kinds of misfortune, and the explanation is witchcraft. The 2 are not the same, and they need to be quite clearly distinguished. Now, going through the first point, there's culture, which I mentioned as the first variable we use, that this is not just natural, but also social. There is an idea of women in communion with evil spirits, or the evil bongas, as they call it. There were such beliefs in early modern Europe too, in the peasant culture. They did have supernatural explanations, but what did happen there was that the clergy linked these supernatural explanations with diabolism or a pact with the devil. Therefore, you had that the women had a pact with the devil, which made them witches. In Africa, women are supposed to be either born with the witchcraft knowledge, which is present in their vaginas or uterus, or they inherit it from their mothers. So the second variable which we utilize or explanation we use is that there are gender struggles over patriarchy, and witch hunts have been part of these struggles. Patriarchy did not emerge full-blown. Gerda Lerner said it took about 2,500 years to be established in Europe. Patriarchy is multidimensional. Men dominate, whether it's household work, economic, or most social hierarchies. In our analysis, we place emphasis on the monopolization of higher forms of knowledge, such as those of ritual and communication with spirits, as coming first and then leading to the domination over other areas. It was pointed out, in fact, by Edmund Leach in his analysis of Burma, that the first professional specialist among the agriculturists, the Sweden agriculturists, is actually the ritual specialist. All the other forms of knowledge are available to all others. So men's knowledge as a ritual specialist, whether the village priest or the village headman, is valorized, is given certain validity or value of the, for instance, the household or the clan spirits, the rituals to be carried out in the fields or in the sacred groves, the plow or the roofing. Now, women are denied access to these forms of knowledge and denounced as witches if they try to acquire them. So in fact, the modern intellectual property rights system is not the beginning of a monopoly of knowledge. There was a monopoly of knowledge even a long time ago, knowledge of men, which was protected by denouncing those who, women who tried to acquire it as being witches if they did acquire or tried to acquire that knowledge. So you have women as witches who try to acquire it and men as witch finders. Now we look at this kind of struggle over the establishment of patriarchy in Africa too. Now, in Africa, there was the dominance of whole agriculture, which, as we would know, it was identified as being the female system of agriculture. It was identified with matrilineal, but it was pointed out the cow actually is the enemy of matrilineal. And there was a large Central African belt of matrilineal, which was identified by some scholars, but there was patrilineal in the south and in the east, where you had cattle coming into the farming system. And along with cattle, either as farming or in a pastoral manner, there was a loss of matrilineal among Bantu speakers. Now, what we don't know, and whether there were witch persecutions in this transition from the earlier system of matrilineal in hoe agriculture to the patrilineal in the plow agriculture or pastoralism. But there are some indicators that there was such a thing. For instance, the historian has pointed out that the Bantu conception of evil was quite close to home, not far away in the distance. And there were also witch doctors among them, which, as we know, the medicine men are those who purge witches. So there was some kind of, there are references in the literature and in the mythology to some kind of conflicts between the witch doctors and the witches who were the evil close to home. There was such a conflict in the Ashanti kingdom in Ghana, where there was, you had a bilateral kind of system where you had women with a spiritual power and you had men as the rulers and warriors. So the women were the spiritual power, and in fact they had, they sat on stools, and the woman's stool was higher than that of the king. But there was a rebellion at one point where the women tried to take over power. They were defeated. And after that, they grew the witchcraft cults in Ghana. So there seems to be some link, and this needs to be explored, about that even in the pre-colonial period, there would have been some kind of link between witchcraft, witch hunting, or the witch complex and patriarchy. Now, in early modern Europe, what Al-Pasha referred to, and where we draw on both Maria Mies, an old friend, and also Federici. In the feudal system, women were not legal subjects, but with the individualism of Reformation, they actually became legal subjects, and they also became potential witches. Some types of men could also be witches, but they were like shepherds or blacksmiths who were supposed to be in communion with spirits, or among the Sami in Northern Europe and Ireland, where they were the shamans. Now, there was a redefinition of patriarchy. There was an attack on the reproductive knowledge of women. Why? To repopulate Europe after the Black Death. Remember that early modern Europe is about 400 to 1700 in the Common Era, which is like a few decades after the Black Death of the middle of the 1350s. Now, in that period, there was the mercantilist doctrine of that wealth depended upon population, and therefore the need to increase population. Within that, the attempt to reduce women's control over reproductive knowledge. There were women who were outspoken or who cursed out loud, were often, of course, condemned as witches, while preventing women also from upsetting the patrilineal inheritance so that land would remain in the male hands. Now, as Christina Lerner, who studied the Scottish witch hunts, summarized it, the pursuit of witches could therefore be seen as a rearguard action against the emergence of women as independent adults. So the third area which we look at is that of structural transformation. Now, all of these struggles have taken when there have been various structural transformations going on. Here we would link the patriarchy and with the structural transformation of the economy, particularly that of the growth of the capitalist market system. Early modern period, Europe was also a period of the primary accumulation of capital. There was intense conflict over changing structures and socio-economic norms. There was the norm of sharing versus the norm of accumulation. These are two very different normative systems, and there were huge conflicts between these two. Witch hunts actually were used on both sides of this struggle. They were used for both leveling and for accumulation. For instance, how is it used for accumulation? The old woman who asks for her dues was the one who would be denounced as a witch. And we were very surprised to find that something like that happened in Rajasthan under the Jajmani relations. So the upper caste tried to deny their dues to women of the lower caste, which were due to them under the Jajmani relations, and denounced the woman who asked for this as a witch. So the one who asks is the witch. Then you have the one who does not give. This is the rich person who's denounced as a witch, often men in Europe, or their wives, or this was called the profit-making witch. Even in India, we have the better off who are denounced as witches because they do not share, they do not give. Therefore, in Africa, we have found employees who are retiring are scared to return to their villages because they would have to share all of their savings. And in Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu, urban employees are denounced as witches for not sharing with their rural cousins. Now, along with this, there was also the enclosure movement in England, which was to reduce the access of the small peasants to common lands and therefore turn them into wage laborers. And there were evidence to show that there were more witch hunts where enclosures did take place. There were also attacks on women to seize lands for accumulation, and there have also been enclosures for large-scale projects, which has been linked to witch persecution in Africa. Now, in this, just a little bit on the gender relations and the structural transformation in Africa, because that has become so important in the overall discussion. Women have been more important in trade And in the growing informal economy in Africa, trade has grown in importance. Accusations mainly center on women's control of cash from trading and commercial agriculture. And as Mbembe pointed out, there is a threat to men's status as household head. And that witch hunts, we would add to that witch hunts are men's reaction to that threat, to the threat of their status as household head. Now, we see some slight variations in these patterns, which are important for drawing policy lessons. In Cameroon, when there was individual banana plantation and a growth of inequality, there were witch accusations. But when they switched to cooperative farming, then the accusations stopped. A very interesting study of Sierra Leone surveyed 2,200 households in 3 types of areas. One, where communitarian relations were strong. Second, where market relations were well developed. And third, where both communitarian and market relations were in conflict. And they found that witch accusations were mainly in the third type of village, where there was a conflict between the old and the new kind of relations. And it was very low or non-existent in the first 2, where either the communitarian relations are strong or the market relations are well developed. This actually ties up with what Alpa was pointing out, where communitarian relations are strong, as say in the hunter-gatherer tribes, you don't find witch accusations. Where the market relations are well developed, as in say the Hindu caste, you don't find witch accusations, but it's where there's a conflict between the 2 that you find the witch accusations and the witch hunts. Finally, I'll just end with a few policy suggestions. So what can we do about this? One is, of course, to foster non-patriarchal forms of masculinity. Second is to deal with the structural insecurity of the spiritual insecurity of structural transformation. That is, these are societies going through very difficult transformations in very short periods of time. People are losing their old livelihoods, the new ones are not being created. So the importance of social security in such a transformation. Then, of course, of non-supernatural ways of thinking about misfortune. For instance, Helen points out that there used to be cholera witches in Chhattisgarh, but they ceased to exist when people understood why cholera takes place. Now, one of the ways in which we can go ahead in developing the economy, but also not increasing inequality, is through cooperative collectivity in new enterprises. And finally, the importance of women's organizations and their land and property rights. So this is a very broad canvas that we have tried to draw. Thank you for everybody for having listened to it for all this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Devnathan. You know, you've covered a huge canvas of 11 chapters of your book, and you've sort of encapsulated it very nicely and presented it, you know, so that everybody has a good idea of exactly what the book is about. If we can now restart the discussants and getting their views on board, may we request Sheila and Mumbi, you know, to give us your comments on the book in the context of African feminists on witch hunts and the impact on development. Sheila, Mumbi, who would like to go first? Because both of you are sharing a presentation. Aditi.
Yes, thank you. I will go first. I'm trying to share my screen.
Great.
And I just wanted to mention that I'm going to switch off my video because I'm having connectivity problems, and so I'll switch it off. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Can you see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to provide this for myself and Dr. Mumbi to provide this commentary. Congratulations to Dr. Nathan and to Dr. Kelka on the book. We're going to provide the commentary from the perspective of an African feminist. and the impacts of witch hunts on development. I will provide the perspective from the perspective as an advocate, which I am, and Dr. Mumbi as from the perspective of an academic, her being based and teaching, lecturing at the University of Nairobi. Oh, I think I'm trying to see how to do this. I don't know whether you're seeing the slides or seeing my script.
Ma'am, you can go to slideshow on the top.
Can you see the slide now?
Yes, we can see.
Yes, we can see, Sheila.
Okay, have I now moved to introductions?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, good. Okay. Okay, so first of all, Dr. Mumbi and myself recognize that there's a growing debate on witch hunting as a global phenomenon. However, these prosecutions are rarely reported. We recognize that social justice movements and even feminist organizations continue to be silent on this matter. And we want to emphasize this point, and I emphasize this point particularly as an advocate and a feminist advocate, that we feel that we are not paying sufficient attention to this, although the victims are predominantly women. Witchcraft has its roots deep in African history and culture, as Dr. Nathan has clearly articulated, and these started long before the dawn of colonialization. With the coming of colonialism, however, Black Africans suffered greatly at the political, social, and economic levels, and this was often blamed on the occult and has led to a culture in which women are further to blame and are oppressed. For over half a decade, feminists from Africa and the diaspora have consistently engaged in an informal discourse geared towards unearthing the salient violence committed against women within their nurturing communes. While such discourse have yielded slow but positive responses, as demonstrated in the various platforms for actions emerging from various international, women's international and African regional conferences since 1972, hunting of witches is a relatively new subject yet to gain the attention it deserves. Witchcraft accusations and killings should concern all feminists from global north and from global south, and it is for this reason that the book is a welcome contribution to the feminist narrative. In Africa, in addition to inflicting an unspeakable suffering of those accused and perpetrating a misogynist ideology that degrades all women, they have devastating consequences of communities affected, especially the younger generations. Witch hunts are also emblematic examples of the effect of economic globalization on women, further demonstration that it contributes to the escalation of male violence against women. As indicated in Chapter 7 of the book, witch hunting is tantamount to woman hunting in the sense that any woman can be denounced as a witch, while only special categories of men, also in Africa, such as those with prior professions related to spirits, or those who became better off, could be victims of witch hunts. Today, African feminists are fighting back. A rebellion of African women has begun in defense of women's lives and freedoms from all forms of violence. African feminists also recognize that witchcraft comes from many societal risks and is used as an underlying form of control over women and their behaviors. This furthers the cultural distress seen right now, such as economic turmoil, social frictions, political distrust, and racial conflicts. It is of particular importance that this issue is explored because the issue of poverty and corruption are not isolated, so neither can be the chaos, insecurity, and violence. And thus issues become not only an issue, so witch hunt is an issue, not only an issue for Africa or for Indian importance, but indeed for global importance. With these few introductory comments, I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Mumbi.
Okay. Thank you, Sheila. And let me offer my congratulations to DEF and COVID. I will continue on this presentation. Sheila, could you please move for me the slides?
Okay, yes, I'll do that. I think I'm exactly on where you should start. Thank you.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. So I will share our perspectives as feminists on the impact of witch hunts on development. And I think coming from where the discussion is going, we can see the magnitude of witch hunts, even though underreported, the magnitude of how much suffering that women particularly have to go through when witch hunting takes place. And from a feminist perspective on violence, something as literal as pain all the way to death is of significance. So I would like to just start from that point, that there has been a lot of, assuming or assumptions on this particular phenomena, social phenomena on witch hunting, leading to underreporting, under-researching, because of the evil that it has been associated with. But then it's important to recognize that in the violence, I mean, in the spectrum of violence, it's just as important as domestic violence, okay? So it should concern feminists as well as development practitioners with equal importance. Next slide, please. Sheila?
Yes.
Next slide.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll look at the impacts of each hunting from two perspectives. First, that witch hunting is an attack on women's dignity and their freedom to effectively participate in their personal and social development. So that means at the personal level, witch hunting actually curtails, women's ability to exercise their personal freedoms within their own bodies and also within their social and political arenas. So from that point of view, I would like to state that witch hunting devalues women so that the men of their communes view them, particularly the very old women, as useless beings whose assets and labor can be appropriated without qualms. I will not read specifically from the bullets because I would like to engage this discussion also from some particular experiences. And at the moment, I would like to share an experience that I have from my own upbringing. I grew up in a rural village in Kenya. And from my childhood, I can recall that we were socialized to believe, yes, there were witches, but we also were told that witches were also women. So this is a fact for me. This is a fact, my own experience as I grew up. And I recall we used to run to a point that one would even fall down if you met a very old woman, maybe carrying some traditional, regalia like gourds or calabashes. They could have been going to the market very, very genuinely, but we were given indications of high, of evidence of what an old woman would look like for them to be witches. And now that I'm now speaking from a feminist point of view, I just want to, or rather, I've been trying to imagine what these women used to go through, because we can talk about the cultural evidence, but in the justice realm, they were not necessarily witches per se, but this is the cultural perception. But the suffering, the untold suffering that these women used to go through and they still continue to go through has been continued to be undermined. So yes, that is part of my own personal experience, and of course from the literature, as we have heard from Dr. Nathan, witch hunts are still going on in African societies. In Kenya, for example, where I come from, we have some communities where witch hunts are still very, very alive. Hundreds of women are killed every year. For example, when people die in the community, particularly when a child dies or when an accident takes place or when a house burns down, a woman will have to pay at one point or another. So you find that women in these communities, particularly the very old women, will live their lives in fear because they do not know what awaits them. And especially if the family line has been, labeled as a family of witches. And of course, I would like to extend that, the impact from the personal level to the very first micro level of the family or the household. You find that the children and family members of those witch labels also continue to be, or rather they suffer together with the witch. So children from such families may not find work. They may be bullied at school. They may even be ostracized, throughout their lives. In terms of affinity or filial, or rather through marriages. A lot of women don't want to get married to such or to men from such households or from such families, and so on and so forth. So that is, the first level impact of the personal level and the family level. Next, please. Yes, Sheila, next. So
okay, so I should go. Just let me know when I should stop.
All right. Okay, please go up a little bit. The first slide on examples.
Okay,
yeah.
Here we are.
So here I highlight two examples. And I think the first one has been tackled quite well, that market women are a social force in Africa and have often been accused, in some communities, they have been accused of being witches. And also thanks to national politicians who have blamed on them the high inflammatory rates the liberation of economy has caused. Now, what that means simply is that where women have been successful economically, they're also likely to be accused of having used witchcraft. And I'm bringing this in as a macro, a macro level impact, in the sense that this may detail women's engagement in productive activities, not just in the communities, but also nationally, for fear of being, labeled as possessing supernatural powers or using supernatural powers, to climb the ladder economically. And then in Ghana, witchcraft accusations developed in the clash between the values of the predominantly female villages, who insist on returning the money they earn to the local economy and keeping it where they can see it, and those of the male businessmen involved in the export-import trade, who look at the world market as the economic level, as their economic horizon. So these two examples are just introducing us to women's engagement in the economic space, and how much witch hunting can detail or hinder them from progress in this particular area. And this again now ushers us to the next paradigm, where witch hunting destroys the family as a social and economic production unit. Witch hunts destabilize family life. When a witch is killed or banished from her family, children are left to suffer. I think that is quite straightforward, and I've explained through my own experiences and examples in Kenya. But I would also want to mention that since women are irreplaceable means of production for their households, witch hunting promotes economic instability for families. And in the event that a woman's property is seized by her accusers, a trail of dispossession is experienced, and generations considering that witches are also most likely to be widows. Next. Next, Sheila. Okay.
Yes,
now,
let's go to the next. Yes.
Yes, as we conclude, I would like to just bring in the aspect of human rights and feminist activism. We recognize that African witch hunts represents for women the suffering they inflict on, and the violation of their bodies and rights. Some feminists may think that focusing on this issue divert attention from broader political concerns like war, global debt, and environmental crisis. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the issue of witch hunts is just as important as any other political, economic, or social issue that needs concern. There may be also a reluctance to tackle this topic for fear of promoting a colonial image of Africans as a backward population. Next. Now, from the foregoing, we conclude that feminists' first contribution should be to initiate a different type of scholarship concerned with better understanding what social conditions produce witch hunts, and with building a constituency of human rights and social justice groups committed to documenting, publicizing, and ending the persecutions. Next. Next, please. Okay. We also recognize that in recent years, we have also seen the rise of anti-witch hunt campaigns in both Africa and India, with women and men going from village to village, educating people about the causes of illness and the interests motivating male traditional healers, local leaders, and other frequent accusations. And of course, that point is just speaking to the fact that we do have some initiatives or activities that are going on countering the notion that witchcraft or rather witch hunts are not being addressed. We do recognize that there's something that is going on, even though not very well documented. Next. Now, in conclusion, we'd like to state that in most instances, witch hunters have operated with impunity, and we are also aware that police forces often side with them or refuse to arrest them, not to be accused of protecting witches or because they cannot find people who to testify against them. Next. Next, Sheila.
Yes, I've moved to the next.
Yes, and governments too have watched from the sidelines, as in the case with Kenya and many other African countries. Except for the government of South Africa, none has seriously investigated the circumstances of these witch hunt killings and other forms of related violence. More surprising, feminists have not spoken up against them consistently. They fear perhaps that denouncing these witch hunts may promote colonial stereotypes of Africans as a population mired in backwardness and irrationality. Such fears are not unfounded, but they are definitely misguided. Witch hunts are not just an African, but a global problem. They're part of a worldwide pattern of increasing violence against women that we need to combat. That's the end of our presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Sheila. Any conclusions?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think those are our final conclusions. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present our commentary and our feedback on an excellent book and a very important contribution to the narrative. And I think our main message going forward is that we as feminists also need to carry the banner and need to scale up our actions on this very important issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila and Mumbi. What you've done is actually you've placed a lot of the issues that Dev and Govind have highlighted and drawn parallels from the situation in Africa, which I think is really important in terms of understanding how this plays out across the world, in terms of persecution of women. So, but the most important issue that you've raised is the silence of feminist organizations across the globe, in the global north and in the global south, on the issues of persecution faced by women who are denounced as witches and the unspeakable suffering that they face. And you've also highlighted, the way in which families and children suffer when a woman is denounced as a witch and is killed because she's a witch, and the fact that it's economically successful women who are accused of witchcraft, and how younger boys want to hijack or usurp the property of a rich woman and therefore try and denounce her as a witch, or the or the fact that the kind of economic instability that happens because the mother is accused of being a witch, and the violation of women as human beings, and the loss in terms of human rights being violated, and the fact that human rights groups need to take up these issues, and governments cannot be standing on the sidelines watching and not taking action on these issues, and the need to reevaluate the position of women and their contribution to societies if we want to get a lasting change in this context. I think this was a really valuable presentation, and you really found that there's a lot of resonance between what Govind and Dev are saying and what you've said in the African context. I think that's really valuable. If I can now request Helen to talk about African contributions to the analysis of the witch question. Helen, over to you. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you. Just first, big congratulations to Dev and Govind on quite a substantial contribution to witchcraft studies. Thank you for the invitation, and I've used your work in the past, so I have a huge amount of respect for the work that you've done. And a big thank you to the Institute of Human Development in conjunction with Cambridge for inviting me to be a discussant. I'm not an Africanist. I'm not an African expert on witchcraft. In fact, I'm more of an Indian expert. My work has been done in Chhattisgarh, so please forgive me if this feels like a very rushed commentary. I'd be inclined to say that the experts lie elsewhere, and the amount of literature that Dev and Govind have covered from African scholarship would suggest that they're more experts than anyone here. So what I want to do is place this book within a context of witchcraft studies, and witchcraft studies have their own histories, and I think we need to pay attention to why it's so important that this book has been written at this particular moment in time, and the impact that it can have on the global studies of witchcraft. So the history of witchcraft studies within ethnography have generally tracked broader epistemological movements within anthropology, and its earliest origins in sociology and philosophy until about the mid-1990s. The legacy of Evans Pritchard, renowned as the father of witchcraft studies for his seminal work among the Azandi and Nyoa tribes of southern Sudan, acted to define where and how scholars of witchcraft studies did their research. His book, Witchcraft, Oracles and Magic among the Azandi was so path-breaking and influential that it grew to become the model of the studies of magic and witchcraft by setting the geographical field site in Africa, the terminology that got used between witches and sorcerers, and the theoretical approach that used structural functionalism. And it set this in place for the next 40 years. So Evans Pritchard's work was seminal in the fact that he undid the imagination that magical practices were a stage of evolution, and that this pointed to a sort of a primitive backward people. So essentially Evans Pritchard's account of Zandi magical system was a rationalist modern exploration, and it contained the seeds of functionalist theory. He believed that witchcraft beliefs existed because they were useful in explanations of certain kinds of questions, particularly questions of misfortune and agency. He argued that for the Azandi, witchcraft functioned almost as science did in the modern world to explain the inexplicable. So he was the first scholar to take witchcraft seriously, to essentially understand African worldviews, and it was groundbreaking for those very reasons. So we can't overlook or understate the importance of his work as the first systematic study of witchcraft. But one of the problems is it set in motion a rather what I would call a straitjacket of how it is that witchcraft studies then started to evolve. So it sent a rush of people to Africa because that's where witchcraft was supposedly to be found. And so what this resulted in was a lack of, or a delay, a substantial delay, I would argue, of at least half a century before we started to look towards other countries and other parts of the world, other than the historical legacy that came out of the European witch hunts, which as Dev and Govind point out, have always been separated from other kinds of witchcraft. They've always been regarded as exceptional, and part of the importance of this particular book is to undo that exceptionalism. So it wasn't until Max Malwick's book, Sorcery and Its Social Settings in 1965, do we start to see a differentiation away from the legacy of Evans Pritchard. He did his work in the 40s and 50s among the Siwa, a region understood to be current day Zambia. And he used Evans Pritchard's terminology, but he came to fundamentally different sociological understandings of magic. So it was a typically functionalist argument that magic and witchcraft were useful because they served to provide a coherent understanding of the world. They helped maintain social cohesion within the community. So this is where we start to get the development of what was called the social strain gauge, which is where witchcraft was understood to ease conflict. It became a mechanism by which conflict could be resolved. So he argued that witchcraft served as a form of social control, and the witchcraft accusation was a counter threat, a response to that. His book was very influential and served to expand a range of possible justifications of magical practice. So we saw a broadening of away from Evans Pritchard's work, and we started to see the work of Max Gluckman, Siegfried Nadal, Monica Wilson. They all started to emphasize the morality sustaining, normative and explanatory functions. So the social consequences were about promoting the distribution of wealth, maintaining egalitarianism, or equally maintaining hierarchy, conflict resolution, or inhibiting social change were all explained as reasons for why witchcraft beliefs existed. So one could argue, what does this sort of old anthropological scholarship have to do with this particular book? Well, it's my argument that Indian scholarship around witchcraft accusations has suffered under the sort of the mantle of that old anthropological analysis of structural functionalism, where Indian scholars have tended to look for the structure of which witchcraft accusations emerge. And I think there's a whole history of Indian scholarship that has stayed firmly in that field. It's only been from the 1990s globally that we have also started to see a shift. And anthropologists have started experimenting with creating new process-orientated paradigms of witchcraft, and also making these arguments outside of the notion of a small traditional society, applying them to larger societies. So we get David Gilner's work on healers in Kathmandu. We've got Watson and Allen's edited volume about Southeast Asian villages in 1993. We have Bruce Kapferer's book in 1997, The Feast of the Sorcerer Among the Sinhalese Buddhists of Sri Lanka. There's been much more recent work, Comparative Pentecostalism and Witchcraft, Spiritual Warfare by editors, now I'm not sure if I'm saying their names right, Knut Rio, Michelle McCarthy and Roy Blaines. We've had all sorts of other books coming from Puerto Rico, Papua New Guinea, the South America. So we've started to see a broadening of the global sphere. And again, this is why this particular book by Dev and Govind is so important, because it brings a lot of the scholarship that emerged in the 1990s, early 2000s together into conversation with each other. So what's also been interesting is that there's been a new interest within African witchcraft and African scholarship, which has seen a group of new researchers and scholars return to the continent to start to look at why it is that witchcraft in a post-colonial era hasn't died away as was imagined it would do. So we've seen some anthropologists describe the role of witchcraft as to dealing with the new complex political and economic changes. So as Dev and Govind have drawn on the words of Peter Guskier, Rowlands and Vania, the Komaroffs and their piece, Todd Sanders, all of these works have come in the last probably 2 decades. And it's really, really nice to see that Indian scholarship has now started to broaden, particularly with this book. So I just want to say a big congratulations to Dev and Govind for drawing on this broad scholarship. I think it's an incredibly ambitious book and possibly almost too ambitious. Some of the questions I have in mind for you is that you must have been forced to leave a lot out. And I'm curious by some of those things that literally with editors and from publishers, one has to leave a lot out, and what might be some of those things. So I think my final, and maybe this is a critique of the book, is there's a constant reference to Adivasi society, indigenous communities, and a constant denial of caste-based societies, Muslims, Christians, as also within India holding on to witchcraft-related ideas. And it's one of the things I've fought against, is this idea that it's an Adivasi problem and it gets swept under that particular carpet. The other thing I wanted to ask of you is whether or not you see the importance of 1 or 2 in-depth case studies as doing as much work as the brief introduction to cases that we get within the book. Again, as I point out, there's so much that has to have been left out of this book, and we can't all write a book according to our wish list. I think it's a really good book. I think it's the start of a broader conversation. I wish I had been able to read this book before my own one, which is about to come out in November. I would have liked to have cited it more, but we'll continue this conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Helen. You've traced the history of witchcraft studies in a very short time, and have also brought the issues of the fact that witchcraft provided a coherent understanding of the world and was a way of easing conflict as well. And perhaps the accusations were a response to the fact that that there was control being exercised in the context of using witchcraft to ease tensions or ease conflict. And therefore, this was in a sense a pushback. And you've noted that there's a broadening of Indian scholarship that in this entire area of work that Govind and Dave have brought through their book. And but you've also referred to the fact that witchcraft and the issues around it are not just sort of limited to Adivasi communities, but that they also exist in other castes and other religious groups. And perhaps that too needs some attention. Shall we move now to listening to Virginia Skaka, who's going to talk to us about the analysis of witch hunts among indigenous peoples of India. So actually going back to being limited to the Adivasi communities that Helen just flagged as a limitation. But Virginia, 10 minutes, please. We're really running behind time. It's now 7:11, and we've got 2 more speakers and then questions and answers. Virginia, are you there? If not, should we move to Kalpana? Yeah, Kalpana?
Yeah,
would you like? Yeah. So Kalpana is going to talk about witch hunts and the gender struggle to control knowledge, land, and power in the creation of patriarchy. Virginia is here. Virginia, we were asking for you.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Sorry, Kalpana.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
if you can take 8 minutes, if we can now start cutting down to 8 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. At the outset, surely I would like to congratulate Govind and Deo for this wonderful book. I'm not an anthropologist and I don't have that kind of range of reading. Rather, I have not really read. Whatever I have read is the earlier work of Govind and Deo, and this is the only one that I have read it. So, it is a little difficult for me to talk, let's say, on the issue of witch hunting per se or witchcraft per se. I primarily would like to look at witch hunting on the wider context. I think what I liked about Deo's book, and which I think because also that is the kind of methodology I really take in my own work. That is a comparative method as well as historical method. And I thought that Deo has done wonderfully in terms of taking comparisons to across globe, across history, and that's I thought was very interesting. Also, I think he provides us a kind of analytical framework which already has outlined, and I thought that was again very fascinating in terms of trying to look at the witch hunt in terms of the culture, the gender struggle, and the kind of social transformation that has really been taking place. And it is at that kind of backdrop that he actually locates the whole problem of the witch hunting. And basically, I know they was looking at it from the lens of human rights perspective, and therefore it focuses on primarily on the witch hunting and the kind of violence and persecutions that really goes through it. And therefore, he doesn't really try to look at witch hunting into the wider context of the social structure. Of course, it is there in terms of, as I said, belief in terms of gender struggle and the social structure and the social transformation. But I think there is a larger issues that is there. So let me just little bit talk on something when trying to relate it to the wider world. Now, in any tribal society, we have, let's say, malevolent spirits, and we have benevolent spirits. And malevolent spirits can always cause harm. And so also you find that the benevolent spirits also can cause harm if they are not adequately propitiated. So there are already a possibility that the harm or the illness or something untoward incidents is likely to come from the spirits as a whole. Now, so that is one way in which one can look at the harm. The other way is that, as you have rightly pointed out also in your work, that the tribals are also as much rational as not rational, in the sense that you find many of the problems or many of the illness, they actually address in terms of their knowledge, and they don't really fall back on the spirits. They don't even go back to the what is called the witchcraft. So, but then you find that there are certain kinds of illness and certain kinds of tragedy or certain kinds of untoward incidents where you invariably find that they take recourse to the witch. And I think this really makes, what is it that takes this kind of transition from something where you find that rational knowledge, the spirits which can cause harm, to a phenomena where you find that the harm can really be done by somebody who uses that supernatural knowledge to do the harm. So there is some sort of a transition problem that has really been taking place. Also, I find that even if you look at the way in which religion is organized, let's say in Adivasi society, invariably, of course, there's secular head, there is a religious head, but a religious head which is formally acknowledged is one who is concerned about the, let's say, the prosperity or the security of the village. So like Pahan among the Mundas, etc., or Naga among the Urans, etc. So these are recognized. But then you find when it comes to the witch, it is not the Pahan, it's not the Naga who actually arbitrates on this, but you find that invariably this is someone else who actually arbitrates. So who is this someone, from where this idea has really come? These are again becomes, and you find that generally you find like the Urans, they don't have a term for, they have a term for this, but then the term that is used generally is the Oja, which generally it is not a term which comes from the Mundari language or which comes from, you find the Urao language and so on and so forth. So I think somewhere else probably we really need to look at this kind of transition as to how this really transition really takes place. The other is also I find that it's Adivasi society, but in Adivasi society you find that the degree and intensity of the witchcraft again varies from one tribe to another tribe. Probably you find that it is very strong in the Eastern India and Central India. So you find, and then as you go to the West, as Alpha was saying, Rajasthan or Gujarat or Maharashtra, you find that there seems to be a little less pronounced feature of the witch hunting. Further you go to the Northeast, then you find among the Boros and the Ravas, again, it's a very strong presence of the witch hunting. But the moment you move to the hills, whether it's the Nagas or the Mijos, etc., or even Arunachalis, you find that the witch hunt almost seems to be less pronounced. So I think what is it that context within which this witch hunting has become very pronounced, let's say in the Eastern and Central India tribal belt, as well as the plains of Assam, particularly. So, and if you really look at that, basically you find that this area has been historically, even before colonial period, there's been long penetrations of the people from the outside. And I think not only outside, but you find alienation of land from tribals and non-tribals, Hinduization process. And therefore you find that, I think somewhere else, I feel that this really needs to be factored in terms of understanding this kind of comparative issues in comparative perspective. Also, I find that, when we talk about in terms of gender struggle and, either what is called witch hunting, either in the context of leveling, let's say, the kind of disparity or the inequality which is emerging, or in terms of support to accumulation. You also find that there are contexts like tea garden, about which again you are familiar with it. And I'm always perturbed, is that rather not perturbed, but I'm really surprised as to what is it really makes witch hunting, let's say, also at work in the tea gardens, in the sense that neither there is any asset, neither there is any sort of, everyone is a worker, and you do not really find. So the questions of leveling or questions of accumulating seems to be very extremely problematic, because everyone seems to be a kind of wage labor, and the wage that they get is really very, very low. So in view of this, how do we really look at? So to my mind, sometimes I feel that it is, yes, it is a patriarchy is there, but it is the most of questions of the relationship. And the moment the relationship really becomes bitter, it is jealousy, it is a kind of, behavior which has hurt someone else. Then easy target is to see that she is a person which has which possessed which, and therefore sometimes I think our internal or informal or our family relationship or our personal relationship, the moment it goes wrong, you actually take recourse to something which is, let's say, is spiritual in terms of the witch hunting. And to my mind, sometimes you find it's basically that it's legitimizing by saying that there is a witch, but actually the relationship, the problem is primarily because of the kind of relationship that has been worked out, and where you find the relationship is become so bitter that you try to eliminate that person's, and then you can't really do directly, and therefore use this kind of supernatural kind of power in terms of trying to see and legitimize that. So these are some of the issues I think which are there. There are other issues that there, but I think I don't have much time because I was last 10 minutes. So I will stop it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Virginius. That was, you raised a lot of very important issues, including the issue of, so how do you explain this in the context of tea gardens? So where there is no issue of owning land, and it's not somebody who's sort of wanting to usurp your land, et cetera, as well as the fact that there are several other areas in which witchcraft is practiced, or persecution through accusations of witchcraft is practiced. Kalpana, can we ask you to please give us your comments?
Sure. Thank you very much to the entire IST team and CUP for this invitation. And of course, to Dev and Govind, whose work I've been following for a very, very long time. I literally, did a speed read of this book in 24 hours because I was actually not even sure I'd be well enough to be part of this program today. I have some observations from that very rapid reading, which I will just share with you. And fortunately for me, time doesn't even allow me for a more elaborate review. My first question, the first concern that came to my mind as I was reading the book, and also as I was listening to Sheila and Mumbi particularly, had to do with legal processes. That is something that, and Dev and Govind do say that they engaged with legal analysts to look at witch accusations and witch hunts in the course of their work. And the question that I then had was that, because as a feminist legal counselor, what I have often confronted is how does one set out the evidentiary terms for a systemic and patterned violence against women? How do you actually make a case in defense of women who have been subjected to the most brutal and most gruesome forms of violence? And so in terms of what Mumbi and Sheila expressed, we are not here talking only of witchcrafts. We're talking about witch hunts, which is unimaginable violence. And it's unimaginable violence on the one side, and it is the anticipation of unimaginable violence on the other. So it's both, it's violence and the fear of violence. And what does that then do? Not just to the person who is the possible target of that violence, but to the entire society in which this violence is playing out, and in which there is no foreseeable future when this violence will not play out, nor a known past when it did not play out. And for that, I have a really interesting quote on Then and Now from Moore & Sanders that Govind and Dev provide, of how much has changed from the then to the now. What has changed? In what measure has it changed? And can we understand witch hunts and witchcrafts in those terms? In looking at witchcraft accusations that stop short of a witch hunt, or to look at witch hunts that stop short of murder, that cause physical hurt but stop short of murder, how does one actually frame a case, even if you have a law? Because the borders of a law are very different from the contours of belief in a supernatural, intractable system. So how would you then build a case, build the evidence, and name the suffering in terms of the cause of that suffering? So in terms of motive, I mean, all of the normal measures in criminal law, in terms of motive, intention, conspiracy, how would you actually frame the witch accusation and bring an accusation of a witch hunt that is different from a mass murder? The question that is kind of related to that is it different from a mass murder that is tied to questions of identity, of whatever measure, of whatever kind? And that is really from from the perspective of the law. If I was coming to it as a lawyer who was faced with a witch hunt, how would I actually frame that case? Because what I have before me are bodies that have been subjected to gruesome murder, gruesome collective murder or mass murder. And that is really at the heart of the human rights dilemma and the feminist lawyer's dilemma, where it concerns witch hunt. Of course, there are a range of contexts and a range of practices. And I think what is quite fascinating about Dev and Govind's book is that it's, in a sense, I was looking at some work on law and literature. And the term that immediately came to my mind is it's a kind of a heteroglossia. So you don't have, it's not a monologue, it's not a single viewpoint, it is several perspectives, several standpoints, several explanations, several causes, several patterns that are constantly jostling with each other, even in the same space. So we are not here only talking about the diversity of tribal communities or Adivasi communities, but we are also saying within the same community, there can be a diversity of causes and consequences. The next point, and I'm kind of actually leaping from one point to another. The next point that I wanted to kind of connect to is the point Helen raised between Adivasi or indigenous communities and why not caste and non-Adivasi communities. My own experience, and this is the one large gap that I see also in the discussion, is that we are talking about Central India, Western India, Northeastern India. There are 6 states in South India. And we are not actually, are we saying that witchcraft and witch accusations and witch hunts don't happen in these 6 states, or do you? Because I know for a fact that the belief in witch hunting is quite pervasive in South India as well. The belief in malevolent spirits that may or may not lead to any kind of violent targeting is widespread. and the fear of the consequences of, displeasing the malevolent spirits leads to a complete fracturing of neighborhoods and villages and communities with absolutely no trust between people who have had perhaps a long relationship before. So where do we draw the line? And, I mean, when does a persecution stop being harassment, persecution bordering on harassment, and when does it, cross that line to become either almost a witch hunt or a witch hunt? So are we talking of bodies, or are we talking of the trajectories of minds in a particular, in a particular political economy context? And if it is about property, if it is about relative autonomy, if it is about female autonomy, if it is about the stigmatizing of older women, of widows, it's not something that is then limited to tribal communities or Adivasi communities alone. These are stigmatizing behavior and perceptions of women under heteropatriarchy generally. So the question that I also had, especially since you say that it stops short of a witch hunt, you may have witchcraft, but it stops short of a witch hunt when you go to caste society. I'm wondering whether on the Adivasi continuum, and this is like a completely off the top of my head question, as I was listening to people talk, that on the Adivasi end of the continuum, in some locations, if you actually see that the witch hunt is an occurrence that is not infrequent. As you move along that continuum to the caste end of the continuum, what is it that we see? Do we see honor killing and wife murder and extreme and gruesome forms of domestic violence that are patriarchy's compensatory violence against women in different locations? Because if you are saying that women are completely subjugated in caste society, then surely we recognize that that subjugation involves profound forms of violence. So what we are then saying is not that caste society has escaped the violence against women that is attendant on witch hunt, but that caste society expresses patriarchal violence in extremely different ways than some Adivasi communities do that practice witch hunting, because we are saying that they are more patrilineal. There is a greater concentration of property, whereas there are other communities where witch hunting is not known, not practiced, and so on. So if we take that cluster of communities where it is and put it on a continuum with caste society, are we seeing forms of family violence and domestic violence and femicide, the broad category of femicide? Are we saying that femicide then gets expressed very, very differently in very, very different socio-political contexts? What I also see is a gradation of pollution. You just give me 3 minutes more, Asha. What we also see is a gradation of pollution. Are menstruating women while they are menstruating polluting? Are women of menstruating age polluting? And if women of menstruating age pollute, then are trans women in the menstruating age cohort polluting as well? And if we are saying that women of menstruating age are polluting, then it's clearly not only Adivasi society, we also have it with Sabarimala. If it is menstruating women who are polluting, again, it's not a characteristic of Adivasi society alone. So for me, what is really important about this study is the multiple ways in which it enables us to make connections between various forms of deep oppressions that women are subjected to, and the way and the extremely difficult circumstances in which women negotiate and renegotiate their claims to autonomy. And therefore, you know, somewhere in the beginning, I think Dev and Govind say that if and when the creation of patriarchy is finished, and that's, you know, that's the other question I had. Can the creation of patriarchy ever be a done deal? Can it ever actually be finished? So what we are actually saying is that at various forms in the creation of patriarchy, there is a circulation and a resurgence of moves to autonomy that are then stamped down very brutally. But there is a period when it circulates, and then a lull when it is stamped down, and then women emerge yet again. And the part, you know, the link between science, religion, magic, obscurantism, superstition is a debate. It's a long debate. And also, you know, what are the continuities between this debate on witch hunting and witchcraft with obscurantism in the high realms of science, where the most renowned scientists, you know, line up in front of godmen, or you know, bear witness to the fact that India practiced aeroscience 5,000 years ago, or that the Indian elephant god Hanuman is actually evidence of plastic surgery. So I think that, you know, if we are talking about belief systems, it's really important for us to look at the continuities, and what are those continuities that actually subjugate women, and what are the enabling conditions in which obscurantist belief is able to cull women from societies. What are the conditions that enable a mass femicide and the fear of femicide as a subjugating mechanism for women? These were my broad questions. And of course, the geographical space that Dev and Govind kind of have looked at from their earliest writing on witchcraft and witch hunting, which is China and East and Southeast Asia, hasn't entered this debate at all. And for me, that is really an extremely rich part of their work, which unfortunately I can't comment on today. Thank you.
You've covered a huge trajectory, Kalpana, in you know, in a very short time. We're running out of time, and desperately so. It's already 7:37, so we are 7 minutes over, and we've got lots of questions that have come in the Q&A. Dev and Govind, how Priyanka, how many minutes can we take?
Ma'am, we can
wrap up, I know.
Yes, ma'am. So another 10 minutes.
Okay,
or so.
1 second. You know, I believe I made a mistake. It was elephant god Ganesha, not Hanuman. Apparently, I made a mistake. Sorry about that.
No, no problem.
Next 10 minutes for Professor Devnathan and Dr. Kelkar to answer maybe a couple of questions.
Okay, should I, Dev, how would you like to do it? Should I read out some of the questions that have come in? Or did you want to respond to the discussants and the issues that they have raised? How do you want to do this? Hey, Dave. Govind?
I think you read out, cluster them and read out, because Priyanka gives only 10 minutes, so that would be the best way.
Clustering them, well, I can try, because they're fairly diverse as questions, but I'll do a rapid read. So, B. Sinha wants to know if we accept witch hunting being a means to assert patriarchy, then do we accept that matriarchal society is free of this evil? And is there anything like a male witch hunting? Then somebody called Sola Fahana says, with few incidents of female violence to males now emerging, are females out on reprisal to witch hunts and aggression? If yes, how viable is this, and why isn't global action being taken against all gender-related violence? Then we've got somebody who says that his friend believed that his mother was killed by witch hunting, but his own belief is that she died from illness or disease. And so and not witch hunting. So would you comment on it? Somebody says witch hunts are a very serious issue among tribal communities. We come across a lot of tragedies, conflicts, and persecution because of witch hunts and witchcraft superstition, especially among tribal communities, causing social disharmony and tensions. And how do we help overcome this prevalent superstition and help them focus on developmental activities? So that's really deviating from many of the issues that some of the discussants have raised. Somebody says education and autonomy on own life has a positive impact on witch hunting and all evils. Ultimate truths, whether the percentage is, is it declining or not? So they basically want data. And then somebody says it's one of the good books covering cross-country data and analyzing the problem. How does one analyze this problem in southern India, more specifically Kodagu and Chikamagalur? So they are flagging the fact that the problem exists in these districts in South India. Then some social groups always exploited by others, with witch hunts being used to exploit women. Why is it that exploitation of men through wizard hunts hardly ever gets known, considering that men generally function as priests and deal with supernatural? Perhaps men get away with being persecuted as wizards. And what is your view of the anti-witch hunt bill, which ends up stigmatizing the tribal community? So I've read out all the questions.
Okay, I'll just answer maybe just a couple of them. There's
Sure.
no point trying to go through everything. One is the question on matrilineal. So have there been similar accusations or witch hunts among matrilineal communities? We have seen this both in China and in the Northeast, among the Khasi, that yes, there have been such issues. They're somewhat different among the communities in China. There has been in that part of Yunnan, which we studied, which is also taken up in the book, there was this idea of women, which having poisonous substances or having these kinds of magical powers or supernatural powers, which they used for creating harm. Now, again, this is in connection with the contact with the Confucian society. One doesn't know which way the impulses came, from this side or that side, but there are these ideas, and there has been this idea of women as creators of evil among some communities who were clearly matrilineal at one time, both in China. In Northeast India, among the Khasi, we find a somewhat different situation. They have an idea of people who are becoming rich by immoral means, and the immorality is represented by that they are supposed to be feeding the serpent with human blood, through which they get rich. Now, out of the 11 cases which were studied by a researcher in the Khasi, 10 of them involved men, and only one involved a woman who was supposed to have gotten rich by feeding human blood to the serpent. So yes, there have been these issues, and they are mentioned over there in the book. They're not the same as with the rest, but they are there. Secondly, the point that was made about the continuum. Now, I think we are not looking at all kinds of femicide or all kinds of violence against women. We're looking at a particular kind of violence against women, which is related to the idea of possessing supernatural powers to cause evil. That is the kind of violence we're looking at, which was there in early modern Europe, which has been there in the communities which we studied in India, and has been there in not just in Africa, but also in parts of the Americas. So that is the particular kind of violence. Now, how that links up with other kinds of femicide is a broader question, which maybe somebody else can take up. But that is not something that we could have answered through the kind of framework that we were looking at. So it would require a different kind of analysis, a different book altogether, to be able to go into that kind of continuity that Kalpana referred to. Similarly, also the continuity, whether it is with South India or with caste societies. There are different forms of these violence, and I don't think it helps us to say that we need to draw the continuity across all of these forms. Nor do we, there is a point, along with continuities, we also have to recognize disjunctures. Things are not, there are, as we would say, it's not just a linear continuity. There are non-linearities. Things change, and the manner in which the struggles, even over patriarchy, take place change. Now, we saw that in the case of Europe. It is not as though there was not patriarchy before the witch hunts. There was patriarchy. As I mentioned in the presentation, in the feudal period, women were not legal subjects. I mean, the man alone, the head of the household, was responsible for everything, and the women could not legally be tried for any crime because they were not legal subjects. They were like children. In fact, Jean Baudin, who wrote the Démonomanie, which is the demon book in French, he had made a chart of the family, at the top of which was the man, then the children, then the apprentices, then the servants, and last the woman. So there was a patriarchy in the feudal period, and the patriarchy was recreated in the capitalist transition, as Alpa also pointed out, where you had now, unlike the earlier period, you no longer had a household that did everything within itself, but now you have a specialization. You have within the household a specialization that women specialize in the reproductive labor, and men become wage laborers. Many of the craft activities that were carried on within the household and by women, like beer making, now became professions, or even healing became a profession and was taken out of the household. So you have a recreation of a patriarchy, but the witch question changes as you move from one form of this struggle to another. So when we did look at it in the caste communities in Rajasthan, as I mentioned, there we found a very different form of the witch question. There it was more like the European one, where the woman who came asking for her dues under the Jajmani system was turned away, and when she denounced them and cursed them for not giving her dues, she was then denounced as a witch for asking for her dues. So yes, there are different forms. One might find it in other areas also, but it's not possible within that one study to encompass all of these things. So, but I would point out in this that there are continuities, but there are also disjunctures. Now, this was an important point in our debate or difference with John and Jean Komarov, who tried to make it, or even with Todd Sanders and Henrietta Moore, who tried to analyze it as being no different. To them, modernity has been there always and forever. There's no disjuncture that we can identify as what we call the capitalist transformation or the structural transformation. They don't find any disjuncture. So I think that whether it is types of violence or the links, or as we put it, the articulation with different forms of social transformation, there are disjunctures, and we need to see these disjunctures and not just put them all into a continuum. I think I'll end with this and thank everyone for their comments and their questions. We will certainly look at them as we go forward. I mean, the book is over and done with, but surely we'll come back to some of these issues, maybe in a couple of years when we have some other remarks and comments and reviews coming forward. Thanks to everyone. Okay.
Thank you very much, both of you, Devnathan and Govind, for for letting all of us sort of go through your book and comment on it, and for taking all the questions that people raised through the Q&A as well. I think what remains for for us to do really is to congratulate both of you for bringing about a very special book, very special because it's really added to the body of knowledge on a very difficult and very complex area, the area of witchcraft, for drawing attention to the diabolical methods that have been used by communities to persecute women, to prevent them from acquiring knowledge, to control them, and to control their access to property, their access to resources, their access to growth, and for demonizing them as witches when they did cross those boundaries, and for creating the fear among them that if this, then that will follow. The fear of being demonized as a witch is a horrible fear to have to live with. And most importantly, for drawing attention to the to the political, economic, cultural layers within which this entire issue has played out. Just one last point that I'd like to make is that the word spiritual and the word supernatural have been used by many different people throughout these 2 hours, as well as in your book, and mostly in a negative way, except when Helen sort of flagged some of the the positive issues around what was being done and how the witch hunts followed from that cohesion that was being created through these means. But I did a quick search for the definition of supernatural and got words like mystic and mystical and spiritualistic and celestial and divine and ethereal and heavenly. And you've got one line in the entire book that I was able to find, which said that some people used these powers for good. But for the rest of it, you've sidestepped the entire issue of whether it actually exists or not. And you've basically focused on what the belief that it exists has done to people. And for me, that was very telling. So thank you. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll close. Over to you, Priyanka. Last words.
Yes. So this brings us to the end of this very engaging and very intriguing web book discussion. So my job is, in the end, is of course to I say the final word of thanks. So I am definitely very thankful to you, Professor Mehta, for moderating this web book discussion, to Professor Devnathan and Dr. Govind Kelkar. Congratulations for bringing out this book, and to all the discussants who enriched the deliberations of this session. I would like to thank Qudsiya Ahmed for introducing the book, and also the Cambridge University Press for joining us in organizing this web book discussion. So a big thank you to all of you for this very engaging web book discussion, and thank you to all the attendees, to all the participants for always joining us, encouraging us, and engaging with us in these discussions. So we will continue with our series. This was second under the Center for Gender Studies, and I'm sure many more will be organized under the auspices of the center. So thank you all. Do join us for our forthcoming webinars. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Priyanka, and thank you to the entire backroom team.
Yes. So yes, thank you so much. That would have been just my last word. I would just like to say thank you to our communication team, which is Aditi, Danyal, and me. And then we have our e-invitation designer Arzu, and our web team, that is Nisar, Wahid, and Fatima. So a big thank you, and of course all of us led ably by our director, Professor Alaken Sharma. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you again at the webinars. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dev. Thank you, Govind. Helen, Sheila, Ambi,
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Virginius is
Bye-bye.
Alpa. Thank you. And Qudsiya.
Thanks, Helen.
Bye.
Look forward to your book.